PG Wodehouse wrote Joy in the Morning during his Nazi internment. That shows fortitude and a commitment. He took as modest eyeballing to his writing, such as did G.K. Chesterton. His truth was that of a mechanical sort rather than organic, which is rather labelled for writing as we stand it today, I'm afraid. A font of comic genius. He wrote, I can never understand why all the critics seem to assume that Shakespeare's plays are a reflection of his personal moods dictated by the circumstances of private life. Even in War wrote of his characters, they all live, year after year, in their robust middle 20s. The only sickness is an occasional hangover. It is a world that cannot become dated because it never existed. And he was acutely aware of the alarming capabilities. And he would have been so happy with a smartphone. Henry Ernest Wodehouse, his father, however, was a very dull fellow. As dull as rice pudding, he would say. He was posted to Hong Kong. They lived in a small bungalow in the city, and after 2 years, Wodehouse had his first aunt and nanny. Now, Wodehouse spent his days weary of toddler tropes and images, tropes we see none of today. He spent his holidays with various aunts, of whom I liked, and were very formidable Victorian women. Mary Dean was the scourge of my childhood, he would say. He spent the majority of his time lower stairs with butlers and maids, manservants. At 10 rounders, he moved to Dover, where he was pegged to go into the Navy, while his brother went to Dulwich College, and he eventually plumped his father to go there. And he won a scholarship, as he was the more sporting sort than his siblings, perhaps. In 1899, Wodehouse called a position of one of the 5 editors of the Dulwich College School magazine. These were very much the days of Betty Bunter and Little Titch, a far cry from the fat-shaming lobbies that we have in the media and inclusion politics in this week's media. It was 1901, and the nation was weeping for Queen Victoria, and Wodehouse Jr. was living off the Queen's Road in London. He spat at the work. And by 1903, he was a fully fledged mag scribbler. Wodehouse was very close to journalist William Thomas Beach in those early years, and did some moonlighting for him when he was on Holes. Geoffrey Archer would be so proud. By 1903, he had his head down at the Globe, and a good journalist. Thomas Wooton Westbrook was another who spied on him for lectures at the school where he used to work, Ellsworth School. The two started to work together, and the school became the mind meld for Blandings Castle. By 1904, he published his first scribble, A Prefect's Uncle, frowned upon today in this age of heights in cost of living and the hop-hatting we all experience when looking at the man more bigger than us, with a bigger bag. Capitalism was then looked upon as nothing to be donned at, and definitely not a shortcut to opulence and caviar. He also went to the US for the first time. He said New York was like being in heaven without having to go to all the expense of dying. When he returned to Blighted there, he spied that he had been appointed as chief of the Globe Theatre. He also published Vanity Fair, writing fiction and musicals for the Aldridge Theatre as well. He was turning into quite the man about town at this point. In 1906, Wodehouse was both an adult and an adolescent. He was very much an introvert, but still clinging nervously to his Dulwich College roots, the old boy network perhaps. Wodehouse was always very aware of his intellectual prop rights. Interesting. An outcry has recently been seshed over who has the rights to certain cultural keys like the police box in Doctor Who. In 1908, Wodehouse hightailed to the US again with the assist of Norman Thwaites from the New York World. He then shifted to the Hotel Earl in Greenwich Village and wrote A Gentleman of Leisure. As soon after which he went back to Blighted with the intent of settling down finally. But he shuffled to and fro across the Atlantic. But it was by 1910 that he jumped home again to start work at the Globe Theatre once more. Wodehouse whacked cricket with Arthur Conan Doyle, and for a team topped by A.A. Milne, no less. Another blight of the old boys' network akin to the Inklings of Oxford, mayhaps. In 1914 he was finishing his latest novel, The Little Nugget, which drew on the brain box of Elmworth School again. Back in London in the fall of 1914, he began to scribble for the Empire Theatre on a review, and then the Strand. Wodehouse then alighted in New York after the declaration of the First World War, and once again keeping at Thwaites' apartment. It was this time that the lonely English expats were bound together, and Wodehouse and Ethel Wosley Ryman were married in 1914, late 1914 in fact, taking a back seat in the writing department. She was divorced and had a young one, Lenoria. Wodehouse adopted her when she was 11. In 1915, he spouted an interview in which he passionately argued that British comic writing was hampered by its class-bound structure. The best humour, he commented, is universal. And they started to bide in Long Island. They were both empty-pocketed at the time, and despite this, they were happy. Jeeves and Wooster made their first bow in a story called Extracting Young Gussie, and his enthusiasm for the character Jeeves made him feel that he'd reached a pinnacle. And enthusiasm led to the creativity rather than to milk the Jeeves IP to the ground in a desire to pervert the original concept to make shed loads of cash in the process. He also pandered in his writing for numerous musicals. All this would be the focus for the next 50-plus years. He was all too eyed of the devastation taking place in Europe, and was very minded of it. His friend Thwaites had been shot through the neck, and he was very alarmed at the Zeppelin threat, and inserted wartime references into his penning. By December 1914, wordage of the war in the US press reflected the weight of the sit. Lenoria was being educated in England at this point, and Wodehouse had started to write notification under various titles in an effort to help with the war effort. But by 1918 they had 3 acres of land and a tennis court, a rather large pile. My Man Jeeves was published in 1919, and in 1921 his relationship with his daughter was growing, and wherever she went, whatever she was doing, or whichever school she was at, they would write on a regular. Wodehouse moved to the French Riviera in 1925 and penned Bill the Conqueror, as well as helping Conan Doyle with one of his spiritual novels over lunch, unaware of the trials to come. It was the late 20s, and Hollywood had moved on to the talkies at this point. But he started to hate it when he started working there, and it often conflicted with his creative process. He found it pointless to stay on as regular. So, as usual, he ferried his time between the States and Blighty so he could do some proper bookbinding at the time. Though in 1927 he took severe blows during the Wall Street crash. In The Code of the Woosters in 1938, he started to expand upon his character Roderick Spode. The Wodehouses had moved to Oxford, Blighty, at the time, and had settled down again to all appearances. By 1939, they had moved to Tourniquet, France, and were constantly hounded by German troops who were keeping their neighbourhood in check. When France was evacuated because of Belgian advance, the Germans took all their food and decided it was unsafe to leave British citizens at liberty in France. After having been shifted to Belgium army barracks in Liège, they were placed again in a former lunatic bin in Tosh, a city outside Upper Silesia. They seemed to have adequate food, but it was undoubtable encampment or imprisonment. The fiction got him through even when Ethel wasn't with him. She'd been sent back to England out of courtesy, basically. As a consequence, correspondence was difficult, but Wodehouse found that he could write to the US and get his letters sent through an intermediary that he'd established there. Ethel managed to shift back to France in Lille, where she would stay during Wodehouse's interment. In 1940, news of the Wodehouse's interment had reached Blighted, and Wodehouse himself had managed to plead for the use of a typewriter in the camp. The Times tried to secure his release, and there was a campaign to do so. The publication of his postcards from Tosh was a flimsy effort to make this. Despite the propaganda to keep his rep alive in Tosh, it was all far away from the bowl of fruit. People were dying from no grub and suicide all over the place, and it was difficult to adjust to the strict regimented routine of things. There was constant talk of being home before Christmas, though this was far from the truth. Journalist Agnes Thuma had brought Christmas treats at the end of 1939 with an ulterior. She was scribbling an article on conditions in the camp, and with Wodehouse's recent noise that he declined favours, figured it would be a good starting point for our piece. The German Foreign Office got wind of all this and saw that it might be a bit of a wheeze to them in showing support for a Brit Yank. They assumed they might stir up some sort of the ground swelling against them in regards to the Allied cause. The US had not yet joined the war, so the Germans wanted to grab support in advance. When the plan went wrong, Commander Lagerfeld Bestilt suggested that Wodehouse write to some of his fanboys. It had the desired effect, and the Gestapo released Wodehouse. It was the 21st of June when the Gestapo arrived, announcing that he should leave his unfinished manuscript as he left. But eventually, he was put in the Olden next to the Brandenburger Gate under Den Linden. It was here that he met Raven von Barnekow and Werner Plack. Though Plack had been sent by the Gestapo to stage manage his broadcasts that he was meant to do for the Germans, which was part of the conditions under which he was released. Like a lot of people nowadays, he was like an old piece of furniture that most people left behind in the scrum to get ahead in the world, and that consisted of a new type of bash. What he failed to realise was there was a diff between the airwaves and the medium in which they were being sent. All that happens in and through radio today, for example. Nazi radio director Eugene Hadamonsky planned that entire nations will be drenched through and through with our philosophy. His major concern was not with the war, but with the kind of blighty that we left after the war. An ominous thought, diversity, inclusion, and the baby boom would pound on through our door. To this day, the Germans thought that Wodehouse's removal from Berlin would lessen the feels that he was working for them, so they removed him to the country instead. Raven von Barnekow had a fiancée in the country and telephoned her to take Wodehouse in. Although Raven was in the pocket of the ministry, he had sympathy for Wodehouse and wanted to help him clear his name. But the Nazis wanted to use him as a Nazi sympathizer for broadcast in Blighty as well as in the US. Baroness von Bodenhausen brought him to her retreat in the Harz Mountains. Her daughter, Reinhardt, was only then 10 at the time, but she minds the enormity of what was happening. Eventually, Wodehouse rafted to sea and made excuses with the help of the Baroness to not go recording in Berlin. In 1941, he was reunited with Ethel in Wilgerhausen. A. Milne and Storm Jackson, his fellow scribblers, attacked him in the press.
I'm sorry to hear that, sir.
Dorothy L. Sayers even pointed out that Wodehouse might not have the slightest conception of what events he had started. His daughter, Lenoria, wrote, "I'm completely and utterly certain he is completely unconscious of any wrongdoing. However, it isn't exactly helping the war effort, so he is very naturally judged accordingly." This brings us to a reflection about how we are judged in the 21st century. Are we to be judged before an event has occurred, such as been seen recently? Or is it better to take the criminal and legal justice system and allow it to do its job without social mores and getting in the way and interfering? But in November 1941, the Baroness von Bodenhausen shuttered up her house for the winter, and the Wodehouses shifted back to Berlin, taking up a pillow once again at the Eldon Hotel. But staying there only compounded matters for him. They were later planted in Auschwitz, as Jews were being deported on a massive scale. He continued writing, closing in on his sixth Blandings novel, Full Moon. He was suspected of working as a spy in the US in the 1930s. Money was tight as a button, and they were staying in a hotel, and they sought other means of dosh as well. By 1943, the Wodehouses were allowed to leave Berlin for Paris. Eventually, they had to flee over the wall from the bombing, so they moved to Lobris in Upper Silesia. As guests of the Countess von Wolkenstein, it's certainly true that much of the pastiche and funnies that were predominant in his work would not stand the test of today's media to any great degree. There are still many theatrical performances of his work, and he is often looked back up with fond memory, but would we tolerate mass media market flourishing with his work? They again seemed in a dodgy situ in 1944 as the French bigwigs considered whether they were a danger to French liberty, and so they once again moved back to the US. After France was liberated, a British barrister was sent to Wodehouse to seek the truth behind his broadcasts. His findings pointed to a position that, while foolish, Wodehouse had done nothing criminal. The Nazis gave in and confirmed this in the House of Commons. In 1945, Wodehouse's case was closed, but it was not until 1963 that he was informed that if he returned to Blighted, no action would be taken against him. Tragically for Wodehouse, the custom report done through Parliament and his further investigations were, despite persistent requests for disclosure, not released until 1980, 5 years after Wodehouse's death. Churchill wrote, "It seems to me that the French are overdoing things." 15 about PG Wodehouse. Is he a British subject? He went on to continue to write for many shows, and so many more Jeeves and Blanding novels, as well as many more ventures. It is a task to list.
I'm sorry to hear that, sir.
But Wodehouse was never able, despite continued help from the British Gov, to shed himself of the blight that had cursed him in Germany during those fateful years. He was a perfectionist who simply wanted to immerse himself in his own security, like much of us, really. The founder of modern escapism we take for granted today. In 1945, Wodehouse's beloved Lenoria died. Things could not be placated. He returned to the US in 1947, and in 1974, his wife Ethel went into hospital for a minor op and never came out. Devastated, Wodehouse left us from heart failure in 1975. His final letter summed up his career so to the point. He said, Everything is more or less calm now, except that hundreds of fan letters keep coming in. One of them was addressed to His Royal Highness PGW, and talking of Royal Highnesses, I got the most charming letter from the Queen Mother. His turbulent career compared as nothing to the misunderstanding and misconceptions we have regarding those who would seek to live life in their own dream, harming no one, persevering as they trundle on. It serves us to remember that we are all frail and seek to find peace in the end. Give us a good clicking, guys. See you later.
Shakanaka.